Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here. My name is Rob Ventresca. I'm president here at King's University College. Before we begin with introductions and opening remarks, it's my honor to invite Elder Marianne Kejiko to join us to offer an opening welcome and blessing.
Sego Sagweg, Ganadololux, Nuaxanot, call it Marianne Neon Getz, Lasluni Nehe, Atnawal Nungitalot, Oneida Ak Nundiot, Slot, call it London Jeet Nundet Nagle, Wagatsanuni Neji, Gahiga, Wan Isla De, Das Pase Hosioste, Hondu, Kaliwadakwa, Aguego and Skaji, Dwatway Nuni, Guatnagula, Deati, New Halandun, Gunjakwa. Jisugu Gatoga ni Honti, Nicoloda de Atoni and the Hugget Naguatnago. Aguego and Skaji, Dwatway, Nuni, Guatnagula, Deati, New Helandun, Yunki Noha. Ague, Jisugu Yak Toga Niato, Niako, Nicoloda de Atoni and the Hugget Naguatnago. Aguego and Skaji, Dwatway, Nuni, Guatnagula, Deati, New Helandun, Oneganus. Jisugu Gatoga ni Honti, Nicoloda de Atoni and the Hugget Naguatnago. Aguego and Skajia Dwatway, Nuni, Guatnagula, Dea Tui, New Halandun, Ohungue, Jisagu Gatoga, Ni Hot Deet Nicoloda, Dea Tony, and Dahaganaguanago, Donington. So good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you all today. My name is Ganadololux. It means she gathers the village or she gathers the town. And I come from Oneida Nation and I belong to the Turtle clan there. I'm also a faith keeper of that clan. And I sit with the turtles in the longhouse in our ceremonies. And I have that responsibility of those faith keepers. And what we do is we work with community and we work with families, and we let people know when there's things going on, such, all of the different ceremonies we have throughout the year. But we also help families sort things out, like maybe some issues they're having within their own families. We also help to do things in the community. And when we talk about repatriation of our Indigenous belongings and our artwork and our, sometimes I'm watching TV and I see these ceremonial masks that we use, and I see them hanging on walls in living rooms in these movies or TV series, and I'm just like, how did they get that, and why is it there, and how can we get it back? Those things aren't meant to just hang on a wall. They have a purpose, they have a meaning, they have a life. And so all of these things that, people have all over the world in their museums and maybe in their homes as a showpiece, they belong to the people and they belong in their communities. And so when we talk about the different things, like take, for example, the kettles, the kettles that are being taken back to where they belong and to their homes, those Thunderbird eggs. And so they have a life, they have a story, they have a history. And so it's important that they find their way back to where they belong. And so the words I said in the beginning, we talk about thanksgiving and we talk about gratitude and that thankfulness of everything that was given to us freely. We were given the ground that we walk on, those little plants that grow on there, the grasses, the tiny plants like the dandelions, and those are all medicines for us. The strawberry that comes, in the first of the spring, that first berry to come out, the leader of all the berries, that's a medicine for us too. The tobacco that was given to me tonight to be here to speak, that comes first before anything, because it's one of the first medicines that were given to us. And so we're mindful of all of these things, and the star world and the sky world and everything that sits in the sky, the moon and our grandmother the moon and our brother the sun. They take care of all of their responsibilities each and every day. And then, the stars that are there to remind us of our ancestors that sit in the sky and watch over us. And they're watching what we're doing, and they're helping as much as they can right now in these times. These times that we're in, it's a big change, it's a big shift. But it was told to us that this time would come. And that we're going to be in the forefront as Indigenous people. Our ways of being and knowing are what people need to hear. They need to hear about being respectful to the land, to the earth, to each other. You know, that kindness. That's how we were meant to be as human beings. We're meant to be of good minds and good hearts. And nowhere does it say to be greedy and to, be hateful and to be jealous. Those things don't belong to us. They were learned along the way, So we're trying to get back to those things, and we're trying to, put everything back in its place. And I think, the work that's being done here and at Western is amazing, to be able to give those things back to where they come from. And so it's really important, that we're thankful for all of those things, because there's going to come a time where, we're going to go through some harder times in the years to come, in the days to come. And, we have to be there for one another. And we have to be mindful of all of those things, and we have to be able to know how to use those things that were given to us. How to use those resources of the land before there's none left. If everything was to die tomorrow, we would cease to exist as human beings. But if we were to die tomorrow as human beings, they would thrive. The trees and the waters, they would thrive, and they would come back to life and get healthy again. And so we need to, as human beings, be mindful that that's our responsibility. We're supposed to be taking care of all of those things. And we're supposed to be taking care of one another, no matter where we come from in the world. And so I would just leave you with those words today, and welcome you here, and thank you again, Yamago, for all the work you're doing. Dani, to.
Thank you, Marianne, for your presence and for your generosity and for sharing your knowledge with us this evening. I'd now like to invite Kiana Sanders and Walker Antone John, students in our Social Justice and Peace Studies program, to offer a land acknowledgement.
Sagoli Swagwe.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Walker Antone John. I am Bear Clan from Oneida Nation of the Thames, and I'm a student in the Social Justice and Peace Studies program here at King's.
Hello, my name is Kiana Sanders. I'm a non-Indigenous student here in the Social Justice and Peace Studies program, and I'm also this program's student faculty representative.
When we were asked to provide a land acknowledgement for the event tonight, we immediately reflected upon the lessons we have been taught by my father, Ray John, a knowledge share from Oneida Nation of the Thames.
Ray believes that the land needs to be acknowledged first when we gather in this way, as it is our original mother. He provided us his land acknowledgement to share with you all tonight.
We acknowledge the earth and its continuing connection to every single living thing.
We acknowledge the early civilizations who lived in harmony with the earth and who continue to utilize the land today.
We acknowledge the future and that together we can revitalize our livelihood once again.
We acknowledge the earth once again, the essence of energy to give us life and love. Thank you to our Mother Earth. Part of gathering is understanding the history of this land and the nations who have lived in harmony with the land we gather on since time immemorial. These nations we acknowledge today are the Haudenosaunee, known in English as the Six Nations Confederacy, the Anishinaabeg, and the Lenape-Wauk. These nations are represented in the 3 local First Nations communities that are located just 30 minutes from here.
These communities are Oneida Nation of the Thames Settlement, Chippewa, the Thames First Nation, and Munsee Delaware Nation. We encourage all to learn about the local history of this land and community to ensure that we are working in good faith with one another, living in harmony with each other, and sharing the land that Mother Earth has provided us. This land is not owned, it is shared.
Yawango.
Thank you.
Thank you both, Kiana and Walker. Again, you invited us to reflect thoughtfully and critically on our relationship to the land and to one another. What brings us together today is both a historic moment, and I think it's a deeply necessary conversation, and it's one that really touches at the heart of who we are as a university and what we owe to the work of truth and reconciliation as institutions, but also as individual members of a learning community. As you know, in December, 62 cultural belongings, items taken from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities more than a century ago, were returned to Canada from the Vatican. Among them was a handcrafted sealskin kayak, along with masks, moccasins, wampum belts, and other items of deep cultural and spiritual significance. Their return was a culmination of years of education and advocacy by Indigenous leaders, and these belongings are now at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, where Indigenous communities are leading the work of tracing each item back to its people of origin. But to understand why these items were in Rome in the first place, we need to go back in time. We need to go back about 100 years, back to the year 1925. I'm a historian, so a brief history lesson, which I think provides important context for today. 1925 was the year Pope Pius XI declared a Jubilee Holy Year. And as many of you know, Holy Year is a special year declared by the Pope, usually every 25 years, in which Catholics are called to spiritual renewal and repentance and reconciliation, and typically occasions major events and pilgrimages to Rome, as happened just this past year. Now, as a centerpiece of that Holy Year, the Pope organized the Vatican Missionary Exposition. It was a massive 13-month exhibition that was actually staged in the Vatican Gardens. And it was designed to actually acknowledge and celebrate the global reach of the Church's missionary activity. And so Catholic missionaries from around the world were invited to send materials that would illustrate the lives and cultures of the peoples that they evangelized. And so from Canada, missionaries sent thousands of Indigenous cultural items to Rome between 1923 and 1925. Now, as we were just discussing, and I know will be discussed today, the Vatican has long maintained that these items were gifted to the Pope. And I think it's important context for us to understand even currently what that means in its complexity. Of course, historians and Indigenous leaders have rightly challenged that characterization, right? It's important for us to remember that these objects were collected during an era in which Canadian law banned Indigenous cultural practices and in which children were forcibly taken from families and sent to church-run residential schools. And so, of course, in that context, the notion of a gift is deeply contestable, to say the least, and obviously hurtful. After the exposition closed, the items were absorbed into what is now the Vatican's Anima Mundi ethnological museum, and they've remained there for a century until now. Now, I want you to draw your attention to something else that happened in 1925, because it connects directly to the institution in which we're gathered today. So on December the 11th, 1925, in the closing days of that same Holy Year, and just weeks after the missionary exposition concluded, Pius XI promulgated the encyclical Quas Primas, which established the Feast of Christ the King. So it was the same Pope, the same Holy Year, the same theological vision of the universal sovereignty of Christ and the global reach of the Church. And so when our institution, when King's was founded in 1925, it was given the name Christ the King College, a name that draws directly from that 1925 feast. So in a sense, our very institutional identity bears the legacy of that moment in church history. It was a moment of triumphalism in evangelization, of asserting the Church's reach to every corner of the world. And so we are, in a sense, inheritors of the legacy of 1925. And that's precisely why this conversation matters so much to us. As a university whose deepest purpose is the pursuit of truth, we're called to be honest about the legacy of 1925, and we're called to acknowledge and understand what that legacy has meant for Indigenous peoples. The same church that gave us our name was, in 1925, actively participating in the operation of residential schools in this country. The same missionary enterprise celebrated by the Vatican Exposition was inseparable from the colonial project that devastated Indigenous families and communities for generations. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action names the churches directly. As many of you know, calls to action 48 in particular calls on the churches involved in residential schools to make best efforts to return records and church-held documents relevant to the history and legacy of the residential school system, and calls to action 62 through to 65, again, as many of you know, speak to education, calling on governments and educators and schools, universities, to ensure that curricula addresses the history and legacy of residential schools, treaties, and Indigenous peoples' contributions. And I believe that as a Catholic university, we have a special moral and social responsibility to answer those calls. We are an educational institution, and we are an institution that traces its very identity to a moment in church history that was entangled with colonialism in ways that we are now beginning to fully reckon with. And so the repatriation of these artifacts is not, simply a museum story, obviously. It's a call to each of us and to our institutions to ask what truth-telling looks like within our own walls, what reconciliation demands of our curricula, our research, our public engagement, our relationships, our daily work. And that's the spirit in which we've convened today's dialogue. So this evening, we're grateful to be joined by panelists whose scholarship, lived experience, and professional work help us to think more deeply about what repatriation means historically, institutionally, and also for Indigenous communities today. Dr. Cody Groat is an assistant professor in the Department of History and the Indigenous Studies program at Western University. He is Ganyagaka, Mohawk, and a member of the Six Nations of the Grand River. His research focuses on Indigenous cultural heritage, commemoration, and access to records held by churches, governments, and other institutions. I think work that speaks directly to questions of stewardship and accountability and repatriation. And Noah MacDonald, King's class of 2018, is Anishinaabe from Mishipikatan First Nation and Canada's first Indigenous canon lawyer. He serves as an ecclesiastical judge for the Archdiocese of Toronto and is currently completing a PhD in theological studies at Regis College. His work and advocacy center Indigenous Catholic self-determination, reconciliation, and the relationship between Indigenous communities and the Church. And so I'd like to now invite our panelists to the stage. And I want to thank you all for being here. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. So we framed this as very much as a dialogue, a series of questions that I'll invite Cody and Noah to engage with, and then we very much look forward to opening the discussion up for discussions to the audience. So, and we have, as we said, we sort of structured, but we're also, I think, looking forward to, genuine exchange. So I think we should start with situating the context. I provided a bit of background there, but I think we really want to situate the moment a bit more specifically. So a first question is, why does the repatriation of Indigenous artifacts from the Vatican matter now? What makes this initiative distinct from earlier efforts at reconciliation? Maybe Cody?
Sure. Thanks, everyone, for having me. This is very loud, so I'll try to find it. I saw Christy jump a little bit, so I'll find a good place to level it. I think it's a really interesting conversation starter, and I think that the interest that this repatriation has garnered speaks to a lot of things. We've heard in the news for well over a decade now the impact of the Indian residential school system, and I think in some people's minds we're seeing an equation of the residential school accountability, reconciliation with this very tangible effort to repatriate cultural items. I think that it's valuable to view those topics in relationship with one another, but I think it's also valuable as well to view them as quite distinct issues. One thing that is interesting is I would argue that this repatriation stems very specifically from one of the 94 calls to action. We had a call for the Pope as the leader of the Catholic Church to apologize for the role of the Church in the Indian residential school system. And there was specific aspects that he was asked, Pope Francis, to apologize for. There was cultural, physical, psychological, sexual abuse. Now, an apology was made. It didn't necessarily check all those boxes, but there was Indigenous delegations back and forth to the Vatican to build this relationship, to nuance this apology, to facilitate this coming. And as part of those delegations, there was exhibits of Indigenous cultural items on display, sort of showcasing what the relationship between the Vatican and various Indigenous nations looked like over time. During those delegations, Indigenous cultural leaders and political leaders saw these items and questioned why they were in the Vatican's collection. So it was really, I guess, a natural outgrowth of that relationship building tied to the apology that this became a topic of consideration, a topic of discussion. Calls were made quite firmly that these should be repatriated. And I think the moment was just right where the Vatican was in this realm of recognizing internally its role, that the repatriation request was listened to, was heard, was acknowledged. As Noah and I will discuss throughout the rest of the evening, I would say it's a little bit of a drop in the ocean compared to what needs to be done in regards to repatriating cultural items, but it's definitely a consequential moment. So a few opening thoughts, I would say, for now.
Noah?
Oh, for sure. For me, it really just shows it's a continuation of a very impactful and unprecedented moment in not only the Indigenous people's history, but the kind of the history of the Church for the development of actions at the Vatican that the bishops in Canada have taken in such a kind of a amount of time. One where the Church doesn't think in weeks or months; it thinks in centuries and millennia. That the advocacy of Indigenous voices, that the voices that are pushing for change and pushing for reconciliation are actually making a difference. And as much as it's to have a partnership with the Vatican being good partners in this process is one thing, but it's the process is being led and driven by Indigenous folks. And so I remember being a student here, I guess it was maybe 2017 or 2018, when I first got the news from Pope Francis saying, I can't come to Canada, I'm not going to apologize. Because he cited the decision of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops saying that really that there wasn't a consensus yet and that needs to be handled here, but don't expect me to. It was a message of don't be waiting on the edge of your seat. This is something that, and saying that we're not coming in response to the TRC. And I remember that just kind of shaking me and literally being in a Catholic studies class and having to kind of reckon with what that meant. But then everything changed, and that was Kamloops, and that was a moment in which case our voices, our stories, everything that we knew, the rest of Canada began to know as well, and that really got the ball rolling on not only the Church's role, but also the responsibility that they need to kind of continue on down this road. And so we see the papal visit come, and then after that, while Pope Francis was here for the papal visit, everyone remembers that Saint Anne de Beaupré, the sign that was opened up, rescind the doctrine. And the conversations that get reignited around the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. It was only months that the Vatican issued a repudiation of the doctrine of discovery after that. And then continuing on after that, we had lots of discussions around, especially from the delegation of the items that were just returned, of them being at the Vatican and how those ought to be returned. And that happened within a certain amount of time. That was much, much quicker than the Church actually tends to work. And it's because of the advocacy of not only Indigenous folks, but of their allies, and because of lay people in the Church that are pushing for a Church that stands for justice, and not one that continues to hold on to these colonial molds that has formed it for so long, to break free of those in many different ways.
In that context, I was thinking the question about what we mean by repatriation, and as Marianne was offering her reflection, I was thinking about the presence of belongings with deep cultural and spiritual meaning, and how did they get there, and where do they go, and how do they come back? So the word repatriation, it's a powerful word. We use it in lots of different contexts. How do you understand it in this context? How should we understand repatriation in this context?
I think repatriation in this context is difficult to navigate. Noah and I were discussing this, and Rob and I were discussing this, and it'll come up a few times because there was this conversation, were these items a gift to the Vatican? And the Vatican very much maintains that language to this day, which I problematize a lot, and I know Noah will problematize a little bit as well. So when we're talking about repatriation, it is this conversation of, is this an equitable transfer, a return? Is this restitution for something that should have never happened in the first place? Repatriation at its kind of core simply means return of something to its original owners. We see repatriation happening in museums a lot. The United States is behind us for a lot of things, but it's ahead of us for cultural repatriation, I would say. They have federal legislation called NEGPRA, which mandates federally the return of Indigenous cultural items proactively from any federally funded institution. Canada doesn't have national repatriation legislation for its museums. We have local history museums. We have universities that have large holdings of cultural items, of Indigenous ancestral remains. Our ancestors' skeletons remain in institutions, such as universities like we have here. So, repatriation is a very heavy word, a very loaded word. What we're seeing in some contexts is Indigenous nations in Canada repatriating totem poles, for instance, from institutions in, say, Scotland. That's what we're seeing a lot, national museums in Scotland and England returning totem poles. And it's been a bit of a rocky road because Western institutions like the Canadian Museum of History, like the National Museums in the United Kingdom or Scotland, have been dragging their heels about repatriation because there's questions of how are these objects going to be cared for and maintained. If we return them to your nation in Canada, do you have a climate-controlled vault to keep these items? Do you have a relative humidity that we require for museum items to make sure they don't decay? And nations have been pushing back repeatedly, saying, yes, when these items return to our nations, they might decay over time. They might break down because we're going to be handling them. We're going to be bringing them back into the nation. They have a role to play in the continuity of our culture. So these items might eventually break down. They might be destroyed. They might be in worse condition than they were when they were housed by the Vatican. So repatriation means a lot of different things, institutionally, museum standards-wise, from the Vatican's perspective. We have Indigenous nations like the Haida Nation in British Columbia, who's really using language of rematriation because some of these totem poles, for instance, have roles that are closely aligned with matriarchs in community. There's different language that we're using. So it's interesting because it's a very simple question. What does repatriation in this context look like? What are we talking about when we talk about the physical return of items? But it's really a loaded, nuanced, complex question. I always tell my students, I'm going to tell the audience now, you might leave tonight with even more questions than you came in with, questioning what repatriation means. You might leave with more questions tonight than you had in the first place, but that's also part of a good learning journey. So,
yeah, well, I tried to even understand, an Anishinaabe perspective on repatriation. I kind of looked at the language and saw that the Anishinaabe Nation had done some work into, what does it mean for us when we talk about repatriation? And an elder from Nipissing First Nation was able to kind of give a definition or a word. Again, because this is a foreign concept. This is something that really has to do with these power dynamics that we're dealing with in today's society. But the word that he gave is Endau Be Gawewin Onig Nemishomish Onig, which means our grandfathers are coming home, and that is the language and the understanding that we kind of place in this term repatriation. And so it is the bringing home of our loved ones, and I think we'll get into this a little bit more in some of our other questions, but this strong relationality that we have with our ancestors and with these items as well, and this relationship that kind of has to continue, in that we are also better caretakers of them, even if they may deteriorate over time, even if they are used in ways that may not be in a climate-controlled building. That's our decision. That's us being able to exercise our self-determination to know what to do with our items that again, belong to our ancestors, and there were tools that taught them. They can continue to teach us, especially with the breakdown of the passing down of knowledge through residential schools and different other ways of removing knowledge. So, whether it's the Vatican calls it a gift or whether it's called the return, it's at the end of the day, that's almost the politics that the Vatican just has to deal with. And I hope to God that one day they actually figure it out and realize that there's getting so caught up on language it could also be hurtful. It could break down the actual true meaning of what's happening, and that being able to focus more on, especially for a sovereign nation such as the Vatican that fights to kind of preserve its sovereignty and make that point of it being a sovereign nation, to also see other nations having other sovereign nations struggling for recognition of their own sovereignty and to find relationships to build there, and rather than again, this paternalistic attitude that kind of continues.
It's interesting and it's challenging to think about that notion of preservation. I think we were talking about it before, allowing, for example, artifacts to deteriorate. And we know better how to, really does though challenge. You think about the norms of preservation and the science behind it and the way in which states and governments, certainly in the West.
Western norms.
Western
Yeah,
norms,
yeah.
exactly, yeah. That's the part of the challenge though, but that's part of the work. And in that sense, repatriation is a part of the work of reconciliation if it means at least understanding, and in that sense, allowing Western norms to be challenged. It's interesting. I suspect that a lot of us would be jarred to think that we're going to let precious artifacts, right, deteriorate, but that's a part of this dynamic. Already, much for us to think about. We talk a little bit about the role of the Canadian Catholic Conference of Bishops. And maybe I'll ask you. Tell us a little bit about the bishop's role in this. I mean, how did the CCB come to be involved in the repatriation process? Why was it so important? I guess in the kind of logistics, if we want to put it that way, of the repatriation.
Absolutely. Well, as far as I could tell, that there's different. There's different profiles that different bishops will get at the CCCB, and there's the Indigenous profile normally goes to. There's a handful of bishops, but some of the usual suspects: Archbishop Smith out of Vancouver, Don Bowen, Archbishop Don Bowen out of Regina, and several others that will collaborate on these different files, and it's interesting that. As much as the church has always kind of struggled, historically with transparency, with being open around how dialogue happens, with being open around how even trying to remove clericalism of how, internal issues are handled, that unfortunately the Indigenous file still tends to be one that's held pretty close to the chest, really because it ends up being one of the most sensitive. And so as far as their role and kind of getting involved, they were the ones that kind of facilitated the papal visit, the delegation going to the Vatican. Interestingly enough, it was they weren't quite as involved with the Doctrine of Discovery, the statement that came out from the Dicastery of Human Development, although they are working on a conference to actually get to the bottom of or a deeper meaning of what the repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery meant. But again, just that their role in this was one of working with mainly with the AFN and the Vatican and the Métis Nations and Inuit Nations as well. So again, being those facilitators to collaborate and work with, again, even if folks, I think quite frustratingly, with especially Indigenous Catholic folks that are again involved in their different kind of consulting circles, such as the Our Lady Guadalupe circle that I'm a part of, and the Canadian Indigenous Catholic Council. We're still kind of really kept out of the loop on that, and that it's something that's still handled with a lot of secrecy and a lot of sensitivity. So, but in the end, it's still a very positive thing that we're able to get to this point. That it is again moving in a way that couldn't have imagined. Thinking back to 2018, that couldn't have imagined it kind of even getting to this point. But that in and of itself, progress. Is important, but there also needs to be that kind of continuing change that happens as well. So, just the facilitators of that, but hoping that it kind of continues with closer collaboration with their partners.
Cody, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting how you mentioned as well. In some ways, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops working as an entity for this effort, because I know if we look to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, the IRSSA, the class action lawsuit that held the federal government and various church denominations accountable for the Indian residential school system, the Catholic Church, and you can nuance this, really dragged its feet a fair bit by saying, there's not a singular Catholic Church in Canada. There's a whole bunch of different conferences that the power was shifted and fractured a little bit. So that was used in a way, I will say, to try to shift responsibility from the church to various entities to then various individuals. And that was not too long ago in the past, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. So to see that shift to more of a collaborative approach for a story that has less accountability criminally, and maybe a chance to be regarded more celebratory. It's a meaningful decision. It's a meaningful action. Then we see this effort to work as a collaborative, as a singular entity. So it's just interesting to see kind of that shift in approach of how the CCCB approached that. That's the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. How they approached that compared to the Residential School Settlement Agreement. Yeah.
So do you see an evolution or change in the approach?
I personally think that this is an easier thing to get behind than something that might be more, yeah.
Sure.
I'll say that. It's easier to get behind this, less accountability for the past.
Absolutely, and that's a really great point that you kind of brought up there. That had spent so much time saying no, we are separate. We that there's, and that's just kind of how the church works. That it's the Conference of Catholic Bishops, it's just a gathering of bishops. It's not an authoritative body per se. But when it does come to items like this, and when it does come to those, when they get a pat on the back, that there's a actually yes, no, it is, and I do think that there was a large shift, especially when they. Especially after Campbell's, and they actually did issue that apology that they said they weren't going to. And even from conversations I heard around how that happened was there were still quite a few bishops who said, absolutely not, we are not apologizing because I didn't have a residential school in my diocese, and I had nothing to do with this, and my predecessors never did because this is it's fractional, it's not institutional, and that eventually they had to kind of just push it and say no. And so it's almost as if they're trying to manage a world that the public and the laity view them as one body and view them as an authoritative body. And so how do you just want to keep on beating a dead horse saying, no, we're separate, or do you actually own that and then trying to actually find better ways to kind of communicate in dialogue, I think is certainly a positive.
Let's turn now to talk about lived impact on Indigenous nations. Again, a general question, but a challenging one, I think, is how does the return of the artifacts speak to identity, to memory, even to continuity across generations?
One thing that I've tried to advance in these conversations is really breaking down the use of that word artifact, and I think that this sets up the conversation really well. When we think of artifacts from this very museum standards Western framework, we think of an object that is static, that is dead, that is behind a display case to be preserved in climate-controlled vaults and with relative humidity. We have very firm museum standards in the Western world. And that language really serves to freeze our cultures in a very specific point in time. It exoticizes us, says that we're quite unique, can put us on display, can put us in a museum for 100 years to show the successes of a missionary endeavor. A lot of nations recently have been moving towards the language of cultural ancestors, really recognizing, as Noah did earlier, the humanity and the sentience of these items. We would argue, looking at the materials used to make these cultural ancestors or to develop these cultural ancestors, wood, animal hides, all of these are natural aspects of the rest of creation, so they have this sentience of their own. And we look at some of these cultural ancestors breaking down over time, like totem poles. That's an example that people can think of quite clearly. Over time, totem poles will fall quite naturally. They'll decay, they'll return to the earth. That's part of the natural life cycle of these cultural ancestors. And I think that part of the physical repatriation and return of these cultural ancestors is not just physically returning them to our national territories here in what is Canada, but also repatriating this idea that these are ancestors who have a role in society, they're going to decay. So nations are going to bring these items into community to physically handle them, to use them as language revitalization aspects, restore the practices of making these cultural items, working with these ancestral other aspects of creation. And over time, they're going to decay. That's a question that the Vatican really pushed, that the Canadian Museum of History now is still pushing. Are these items going to be preserved and cared for and maintained? And we really have been pushing, saying that when we welcome these ancestors back, we are going to welcome them back in a way that is culturally relevant to us. So when we ask these questions about what do these artifacts represent, it means a very fundamentally different thing. And even when we were having lunch earlier, there's these questions about when are we going to see an itemized list of what's being repatriated, or when might we see photos of what's being repatriated? And the reality is we probably won't. We might not, and that's fine, because as our elder was saying at the beginning, some of these cultural items were never meant to be publicly displayed. They have very specific cultural roles. They're meant to be part of ceremonial practices, cultural practices, through certain familial lineages, used at certain times of year. They're not meant to be displayed behind a glass display case. And also, the itemized lists, when we say that these items were taken under duress or taken without our consent, then I don't even think that necessarily there's that need to justify what is being returned to us. So what artifacts mean, what cultural ancestors mean, can be fundamentally different based on who you ask.
Yeah, and I'll kind of return back to the word mishomish onig and nokomis onig, and so both our grandmothers, our grandfathers, and we call them that because has anyone ever been in a sweat lodge before? What do you call the stones in a sweat lodge? Exactly. And so we use our grandfathers, we heat up our grandfathers and grandmothers, and they are our tools. They gift us their essence in the sweat, and they give us the heat, and sometimes they break down. When you pour the water on or whatever, they'll crack, and that's okay. It's because they've been around the earth for so long. And they hold knowledge, and they are able to serve that special purpose, and they teach us. And just like these artifacts are not necessarily just artifacts, they are teachers. They are our grandfathers and grandmothers. And so being able to acknowledge that yes, things will break down, but it's because they have a purpose. It's because they should be used. It's because they should be teaching us, and it's because we want to honor that relationship. And so again, much like the grandfather stones in a sweat, these are that same energy and that same reverence that we hold as being teachers, as being useful, even if they may break, even if we may not be able to use them again. They're lessons that we'll be able to learn. We'll be able to pass down in other ways.
If I may, Rob, just building on that again, a really important point is these are teachers. These are vital to passing down knowledge and culture and language. And as Rob mentioned as an introduction, they were entered into the hands of the Vatican at a time when cultural practices were explicitly banned by the federal government through the Indian Act. Now, one thing I try to stress repeatedly is the Indian Act is a piece of federal legislation that's still in effect. I carry an Indian status card in my pocket that says Cody Groat is an Indian per this very specific federal statute saying that I have enough blood quantum to say that I reach this threshold federally. And it's interesting, so when we talk about these being cultural ancestors returning to our communities to fulfill and maintain this role as educators, as teachers, we have to recognize that they were taken and entered the hands of the Vatican in a time when those practices were deemed illegal per the federal government, and the church had a very active role in enforcing that ban as well. So it is all intrinsically tied. A lot of loose threads, I would say.
I think that leads well to the next question about accountability and about institutions. You mentioned that many institutions, including universities, hold cultural artifacts and belongings. So what does the question accountability look like, and how can institutions, including universities, ensure that it's that our commitments, our professed commitments, are sustained and substantive, and not merely symbolic or even rhetorical, if I may.
Do you want to start talking about
Sure,
this?
Absolutely. I think that not everyone has these cultural ancestors or these very rare and important things in their possession. That's only these few major institutions, and that's not necessarily going to be something that anyone that wants to make a difference or wants to build relationships can do. But what you can do is help in repatriating knowledge, and when that's a gift that we were lucky enough to have here today with our elder Marianne that spoke to us in the language and was able to share those teachings there. That was an act, in many ways, an act of repatriation and an act of taking that back and sharing that through an institution that for that when I was here, I don't, this is something that at least in my experience, these are developments that are happening in real time that are making larger and larger differences. And so finding ways in which case these institutions can help to repatriate knowledge, that's funding knowledge keepers, that's funding programs, that's building relationships with Indigenous communities, that's examining how whether it's the church, whether it's a local parish, or whether it's even in our schools, that there are opportunities to again repatriate this knowledge and again fund support and find avenues in which case these great things can happen because not everyone's going to have a beautiful sealskin canoe that's locked up in their attic, but what they do have is they have great community resources that they can again build relationships with and find ways in which case they could help that community thrive.
So the repatriation of knowledge, of language, independent of material goods.
I think a lot of things associated with this question, and we've spoken, the three of us, at various times about process and the process that led up to this. And one thing that really sits with me still, and I would say that leads to significant frustration, is the language that was used in relation to this specific historical moment of the repatriation of these cultural items. The Vatican still maintains actively, and the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops maintains that this was a gift to Indigenous nations here in Canada, language that has been contested quite significantly by Indigenous nations openly, because we acknowledge quite justifiably and with historical evidence and substantiation that a lot of these cultural items were taken under duress in a time when our cultural practices were deemed illegal. I will note that there is diplomatic practices in which Indigenous nations do gift some items to build relationships and engage in nation building, and that happened with the Catholic Church. That being said, to frame this entirely as once a gift and now a gift is very much an essentialization of what happened, brushing a broad stroke, I would say. And then also one thing that's fascinating as well is if you look at every statement that the Vatican has made about this and the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, is the Vatican has not returned these items to Indigenous nations. The Vatican has gifted these items to the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, who will then be gifting them to Indigenous nations. And we've heard that the Vatican has been quite transparent or not transparent. The justification is because they do not want to establish a precedent of the church returning cultural items directly to Indigenous peoples. Because the precedent it will set, it has already set, but could have set, will be quite significant internationally. The collections are not just limited to Indigenous peoples in Canada. It's collections of nations in Africa and Asia and South America. So when we look at accountability and we look at power and we look at these questions and the role that they can have, I think an important step is even doing damage control in a way of what's already been done, of readdressing that language of gift, of church-to-church transfer for a specific purpose. And I will agree with what Noah said, that there's been a lot of significant change really fast in relation to the history of the Catholic Church, which is fair, which is true. There's much more that can be done, and I think an important step is going to be the transparency of answering why those steps were taken and that language was chosen quite openly.
Another question just came to me.
Sure.
I'm not sure we can answer it, but was there any involvement or any commentary from governments, from the federal government, for example?
Prime Minister Trudeau had a very active role in this. He spoke with Pope Francis twice directly regarding this at the urging of the Assembly of First Nations and the Métis National Council and Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. And then the leaders of those three political organizations, Nathan Obed, of ITK, Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, played very active roles. So the federal government played quite a significant role, and then the national Indigenous organizations played quite significant roles in this. But it was interesting to see that the now former Prime Minister made quite consistent messages saying, I've spoken with the Pope regarding the repatriation of cultural items, and he made it quite a little bit of a cause, which is interesting.
Absolutely. I actually think that this advocacy that was seen, especially from Trudeau and also more so even by the AFN and other organizations that are pushing for this. That there was three parties always kind of really working together to make this happen. But as far as the ideal for me would have been that this was a nation-to-nation gift, not a Vatican City to Canada. It would have been a working with as one nation that's struggling with sovereignty, like wanting to assert sovereignty, working with other nations that have sovereignty, being able to. And the thing is that goes back goes back hundreds of years. Think about the Mi'kmaq Concordat, one of the first agreements that was made between the Holy See, or the Vatican, or the Church and Indigenous peoples, was made with Chief Membretu, in which case there was the college exchange and this exchange of this promise to keep on exchanging culture. And even after the First Vatican Council and other church, there was an exemption that even the Mi'kmaq were able to continue using their own language, and were one of the only groups in the entire world that didn't have to do their mass in Latin. And so there's a long history of the church having nation-to-nation relationships, and it was a shame that they didn't continue that long history.
And that you think that was intentional in this case? Obviously.
Yes, that or even if it was definitely intentional that it didn't go back to Canada. And I think it was just a missed opportunity, and I think in many ways it was a missed opportunity not to give it back, to work with individual nations, or to work with nations as a whole. And if anything, I personally would, giving from the Vatican, giving it to Canada, that's one colonial power giving to another colonial power, and trusting that they'll do the right thing, and that's just as problematic as giving it to the bishops to do the right thing. The ideal way, what really should have been done, has been a much closer dynamic and relationship with the nations to actually see that partnership again, because it's something even in Vancouver, the Sacred Covenant that was entered into by Archbishop Miller and the Kamloops Band of building relationships of more of a recognizing nations, and that relationships of one-on-one, not necessarily having to have intermediaries halfway through.
So you call that a missed opportunity?
Yeah.
We'll have lots of questions, I think, from the audience as well. So let's ask a few more, though, part of our discussion, and then we'll invite everyone to join. So let's think a little bit about both missed opportunities, but also, again, what was achieved, what was advanced, right? As we think about a journey, we think about truth and reconciliation. I saw one Canadian religious sister said, we can't reconcile if we don't know the truth, and so there's an element here of truth-telling and accountability that can advance, one hopes, a process. But there are clearly opportunities missed and yet to explore. So talk to us a little bit about what you think was advanced here, what's left unresolved, what possibilities are open now that weren't open before, or not?
I think that when I think of missed opportunities, I'll go back to language I used a little bit earlier. I think that this was a really easy win, admittedly, for the Catholic Church, and I think that it was approached in a way that made it a bit of an easier win, gifting, really celebratory, and also a small fraction, because these are cultural items associated with this specific museum exhibit from 1925. The Vatican collections are very extensive, and one of the problems is, and this is touched upon in a lot of your academic work, Rob, is that we don't even know what's in the Vatican collections. It's a secret kept quite close to the church. So, there's thousands and thousands of more cultural ancestors to be returned, to be repatriated in the future. I also think, for instance, of how the apology was so consequential, so important, but if we look at the specific wording of the TRC calls to action for the apology from the Pope, it says physical, sexual, psychological, and mental abuse. And if you listen to the Pope's apology, the word sexual is skipped over. And to me, that's very intentional. It's with the wording of gifting and church to church. It's a very intentional step again. Even in that apology, which is important and very, very consequential, it apologizes for the roles of individual actors in the operation of residential schools instead of kind of an institutional apology. So this was meaningful. It was important. It's going to set the stage for more future work. But I think, again, as part of it being a step on a broader journey, it was still something that was done, maybe a small step from what could have been a much longer step, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's one that also really calls the church to reevaluate the relationship with Indigenous peoples, both as a as with the church as a whole, with Indigenous peoples as a whole, but also again looking at the church and individual communities, and also even when those two merge of Indigenous Catholic communities, and trying to understand the relationships that we do share, and the importance of maintaining and investing in and bringing to life and empowering those communities is an important kind of step from here. There's and also looking at even kind of from an outside perspective, seeing again the role of the laity that played in this. The Vatican, the return of these items, it wasn't necessarily all. It wasn't all funded by the Vatican. It wasn't all funded by Canada or the nations. It was funded by lay people. It was funded by the patrons of the Vatican. What are they? Patrons of the Vatican Museum of Arts. They put out a call to the Canadian chapter that they need $100,000 to actually ship everything to do this, and then put that call out. And then it was everyday Canadians, as lay Canadians that were interested and believed in the Vatican's collections, the art and museums that they have there, that saw this as important to do. And so there's kind of goodwill and relationships across the board that need to be tapped into and fostered. And it's easy to find these places where they kind of break down in the relationships and things that could have been done better. But there's a lot that's happening at the top, but there's so much more that's happening right in the middle and at the bottom. And for us in this room, and for us kind of even interested in these topics, that again, finding ways to make relationships, finding ways in which case we could actually start giving gifts in a good way. There certainly are gifts that were given in a good way, and things even such as like names. One of the most sacred gifts you could receive is a name. That's what when it's in the Anishinaabe tradition, when you pass on to the spirit world, the Creator will call you by your name that you received in ceremony. And so missionaries and priests and would be given names. One of the most sacred gifts you can receive, and because of these exchanges, because of these beliefs of sharing, and so. If we could get back to, again, sharing in a good way, sharing in a way where there's equal power and love and mutual respect, that's a lesson that we could take away from this, is how to go forward in a good way.
Thank you. Why don't we open the floor to some questions? Ready for some questions?
Perfect.
I've got a few others that I'd like to ask you both, but so there's one microphone just to the back. If you've got a question, please. And if you need to, we're happy to bring a microphone to you. So if you're able, there's a microphone at the very back. Or we will.
I always tell my students it's awkward for everyone if nobody asks a question. So don't feel ashamed. But it looks like we've got some.
Hello, everyone. First off, Chimigwech and Yawango for sharing your teachings and knowledge and perspectives with us. I really appreciate it. I'm interested to know, when we talk about repatriations, we're not necessarily only talking about artifacts, right? Or cultural ancestors or grandfathers or grandmothers, as you called them. I'm wondering what you think the significance might be for larger Indigenous-led movements and amongst Turtle Island here. Specifically, I'm thinking in regards to the land back movement, but I'm just wondering whether you think this is momentum for other movements and what this could mean for more Indigenous sovereignty in Canada.
Well, I think that's a really important point, and one that may have I'm sure was on our minds the whole time. But the most when we're talking about conversations of repatriation and of taking things that weren't always exactly theirs or taking it in a bad way, we acknowledge that at the very beginning of our conversation with the land acknowledgement, and that this does push forward a conversation around if we're exchanging and bringing back artifacts, what about the land? And it might not necessarily be that same way of okay, this. The church giving back all of its property to Indigenous nations, but what it could look like is finding ways to use the land as a foundation for partnership. Something really amazing things that are happening, especially actually kind of near your community. Someone named Adrian Jacobs, who does, he was a Mohawk kind of theologian and someone that works in different ecumenical groups, has formed partnerships with some Mennonite churches, in which case, a percentage of their weekly collections they donate it back to. I'm not sure if it's actually Six Nations as a whole or to some of their organizations on reserve, but they build a partnership off of the land, and entering into those agreements and negotiations. That's when gifts, the gift of the land that they're able to worship on. That's the gift from the Indigenous nation, from the return of some of those donations and kind of building back. That's that reciprocal relationship. So finding ways in which case, that those relationships of reciprocity rooted in the land can be a really, really unique way to take those next steps forward. I don't know if the Catholic Church is quite ready for that, but wouldn't it be beautiful if it was?
And, I think a broader structural change that this might eventually lead to, one thing that I keep going back to is how a lot of Canadian institutions still have Indigenous ancestral remains, human remains, in their collections. Institutionally, Western, that's a problem that it's experienced. Part of the problem, and the Canadian Museum of History, where a lot of these cultural ancestors from the Vatican are now being housed. Now, part of the problem with that, and similar to the questions with the Vatican collections, is Indigenous cultural items and Indigenous ancestral remains were labeled so poorly because there was that lack of respect allocated to them that it's hard to know which nations these cultural ancestors need to be returned to. Especially problematic for Indigenous ancestral remains, human remains. So it's a step, but there's still so many structural problems that are raising barriers. Another thing is there's cultural ancestors of human remains from Six Nations of the Grand River at the Canadian Museum of History. Now the problem is we don't have ceremony for returning ancestors who have been disinterred from the earth, brought into a museum collection. We don't have ceremony necessarily established to bring those ancestors home yet. So, that's something that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of conversations on land with elders, knowledge keepers, language. There's a lot of aspects associated with this. So it's tricky because, yes, it's a step in the right direction. Yes, it's going to be positive and consequential, but there's so many structural barriers that don't allow us to move faster. And that's both due to the slowness of institutions dragging their heels, but then also culturally, there's barriers for us where we have to do this in a way that is reasonable for us because it was such a significant rupture when these ancestors or items were taken that we can't just, resolve that by returning them immediately either. So small steps are happening, but yeah, it's a long journey.
Thank you. Next question.
Amasa, my name is Grace Vickers. I'm actually one of Cody's students. So, hi, Cody. I just want to say doyaksam nisam to all of you for sharing and coming up here to have this conversation. No, I believe it was you were talking a bit earlier just about the colonial constructs of religion and moving away from that. And that was something that kind of piqued my curiosity. So my question is a little bit more towards you. And I know that you studied theology, so I was curious to see what you kind of meant by that and how kind of you can move forward with religion in a decolonial sense. That's kind of what my mind was going to. So.
For sure. It's as far as I'll even frame it in a bit of a story that kind of recently happened of in many ways that there's things that this church can still be taking from Indigenous people, especially Indigenous Catholics. And as much as this progress is happening, and this saying that things have changed and things are going forward and you can practice the way you want to, or that these constructs, there's still these colonial things that exist that are essentially spiritual violence. One example is recently my brother, he works in the Halton Catholic District School Board. And there was they go from school to school, and one of the kind of worked with Indigenous students, in which case one time they were going to be, they always begin with the smudge. And they said, okay, well, we're reading in the chapel, the smudge in the chapel. In which case the chaplain then called the parish priest, and then the parish priest said, that's demonic, that's devil worship, absolutely not, you cannot do this here. And it is it's just so, and thing is, I've heard that same story probably 5 times this year in different cases, in different places, and that there's still this things that are taken from us, being able to kind of practice our own spirituality, practice in our own way, being able to go into a sweat, go to shaking tent. There are things that it's going to take a lot of work to get past. It's one thing to get past the actual physical violence, the actual, the genocide that occurred that we're still having to reckon with. But it's these things that folks that are still kind of navigating and trying to find their way through. And it's unfortunate that there's no perfect answer as far as how to have a decolonial approach to religion. It really comes down to self-determination and the self-determination of communities of how they are able to determine how they practice their spirituality. How do they honor their ancestors in sense of both ways? And that certain communities, such as my own, again, have had. I could track the baptisms of my grandparents to my great-grandparents to the great-great-grandparents, all the way back to the very first kind of conversion in Mishmacotton and Jesuits all the way down. That there's these long lineages of faith, but also this being able to navigate. What does that mean, and how can we still preserve and practice our own way? And it's not going to be easy, but it's one that kind of comes down to community, and sometimes it's best to kind of get to there first before tackling that big question to know how you do it, how your community does it, how your family does it, and then hopefully then deal with the folks that try to take it away.
If I can just add to Grace's question as well, you can sit down if you want, Grace. I teach a course at Western called Residential Schools, which is about the Indian residential school system. And the questions of decolonizing the church is really interesting. And one of the examples I discuss is Rose Prince, who there's a cause for canonization open for her to potentially eventually lead to her sainthood, either Prince Rupert or Prince George, I don't know specifically. But one thing that's really interesting about her case is she was an Indian residential school survivor, who then worked for the residential school, who then died in the residential school of either influenza or tuberculosis, buried in an unmarked grave at the school. And the cause for canonization was opened years ago, but now we look at this is a residential school survivor who died in the school system, was buried at the residential school. But then there's all of these questions because, as Noah says, and we can all concede to this, there are Indigenous Catholics. There's deep histories of Catholicism and Indigenous peoples, and either finding cultural mediation, cultural pathways. So it's so tricky because when we talk about decolonizing the church, and we can call out the structural, but we also have to recognize very legitimately the important role that Catholicism plays with Indigenous peoples in their nation. So it's a tricky question.
Thank you. The question?
Hello, my name is Paul. My mother is Métis Cree from the Pas, Manitoba. And I was just thinking that, Cody, you mentioned bishops who would say, there weren't residential schools in my diocese or parish, and going back in time, I've had friends that I knew who would say, well, that happened a long time ago, and it wasn't us, so that's way back, so we don't really have responsibility. But I was just thinking that the grandfathers that you speak of, the not artifacts, but the grandfathers, they have a role, they are living, and I'm just thinking maybe one of their beautiful roles is breaching that gap in time that people can use as an excuse, and they're fulfilling this beautiful way of healing. Whether they were taken in a not so honorable way or not, now they're giving a repurpose for this time in our generation. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, and I'll give it to Noah afterwards because I think that was Noah's comment about the various bishops. But I agree with you that, again, the role of these cultural ancestors might be much more broader than it was in the past. And one thing I think about is how the Assembly of First Nations, the Métis National Council, and Inuit Tapiri Kanatami are all approaching these cultural ancestors from very different ways. So the Assembly of First Nations is being quite quiet about which cultural items are being returned to community. That consultation process is very insular, very guided by elders and knowledge keepers. The day after the cultural ancestors arrived, Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami had Prime Minister Mark Carney and Governor General Mary Simon come and look at these cultural ancestors, and there was photos, and they were able to learn from community members. And it's interesting how we're seeing different nations approaching that educational role in quite fundamentally different ways. I think one thing that's almost easier in a sense for Inuit communities is that Inuit are quite a singular political and cultural entity compared to the Assembly of First Nations, where we have, well, nearly 100 different nations in Canada. And these cultural items might have protocols tied to all of these different nations across the country. So it's harder for them to have that kind of singular response or educational role. But I agree with you that they will probably transcend the role that they initially had in community. And I think that we're already starting to see, I've said that some of these cultural ancestors might decompose, break down over time. We might see that some of these cultural ancestors are put in more of a museum context because they were part of that longer journey from the Vatican to back to nations. So it'll be interesting to see, because they were so forcibly removed from their context in which they should have been living these items. So obviously the role that they're going to have into the future is going to be fundamentally different as well.
And I think that yes, the items in particular, the specific, will offer that window back into the way that we had used to do things, or even continue to do them, and still see and be able to trace that lineage. But one really unique thing that at least I kind of see emerging out of this, it's also showing us a window to even before 1925, when they were taken, or even further back, of nations working together, of especially and supporting each other and finding different ways to collaborate. When the items kind of came back from the Vatican and landed in Montreal, it was Ganawage and the chief there, and as well as the Mohawk peacekeepers. They said there's no identified items that we know that actually belong to us, but they're landing here in our territory, and we're going to help protect them. We're going to have our peacekeepers bring them, transfer them, drive with the vans from here to Ottawa, and we're welcome. Kind of is that the pressures of like the eastern doorway. When newcomers are coming, we're taking on a role as they're passing through and protecting them. And then even same with, I think, Chief Diabo offered this, Natan Obed, saying, if you guys, I know you're still making decisions regarding the what you guys want, but we just built a brand new museum here, so it has a home here if you'd like it, and we could support you this way. And so knowing that even nations that are finding new and different ways to work with each other around these things, it's bringing us back into dialogue with each other and finding really cool and constructive ways to support each other that's completely even separate from the church or from the government. It is just nations working together.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. My question is, would it be the hope of the First Nations that all of the artifacts be returned? All of the cultural ancestors be returned from the 1925 collection, and I'm presuming that the answer to that would be yes, but those gathered prior to the 1925 collection.
So I'll start by saying, first of all, I love it when a learning moment has struck through. So your change from artifacts to cultural ancestors is very much appreciated and acknowledged. Thank you. So I will say all of the items from the 1925 exhibition have been returned. So that was this whole slew of items. So that's addressed. Now it's so tricky though, because I think more than making a direct answer if everything should be returned, I would say the first demand is that accountability for just knowing what is all there. Some of the cultural ancestors that were returned were wampum belts, as Rob mentioned at the beginning. Wampum belts are diplomatic agreements. They're deerskin and then quahog shells. It's a form of diplomatic agreement that nations in eastern part of what is now Canada, United States. My nation made them quite a bit. So some of those diplomatic wampum belts that we exchanged with the church, there might be value in those remaining in the church's collection because it might speak to a diplomatic political agreement made between nations and the church. So there could be some value in that staying there so that the church is aware of its ongoing political relationship. At the end of the day, we just simply do not know what is in the Vatican collection well enough to be able to make a single answer. And I think that we will never have a single answer, but at the core, it's going to be accountability is what needs to be done immediately.
And I'd say I'd echo that a lot as well. Just, just the importance of, again, saying that everything that the Vatican has is stolen is also offensive. Is also kind of offensive in some ways to Indigenous people. In which case, there were, it's quite reasonable to believe that there were actual acts of self-determination of Indigenous folks giving things to missionaries, giving things to their friends in that sense, in certain areas and certain expectations that were honest gifts that they don't necessarily want. That would be almost wrong to return. But the thing is, we don't know the history behind every item. We don't know that. And thing is, we need to actually get to a point where Indigenous folks and the Vatican scholars and bringing groups together to know what's there and to start working collaboratively. Again, this kind of this is a big invitation to again start working collaboratively, start working nation to nation, and having ways in which case, how about we get to the bottom of things together, and know what is how do we honor gifts that were given, and how do we honor things to return them as well, and so and that will again give us a much brighter, or not necessarily brighter, but shine a light on history in a way that that should be done, and one that has a perspective of both, that kind of two-eyed seeing.
Thank you.
I'm really happy to hear that last response, because I sensed during the presentation that there was an emphasis on the cultural ancestors that were forcibly taken, and I heard that word forcibly taken repeated several times during the presentation. So I'm happy to hear that there's an acknowledgement that some of the possessions that are in the Vatican were given as genuine gifts, person to person. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, we have Christy, of course. Yes.
Thank you. Miigwech. Bonjour. My name is Christy Brissette, and I'm from Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. And I've had the great privilege of learning my whole life from my elders. And one of the things that they share with me is that all of these things we're talking about are teachers. And they also teach us about how things aren't static. Things aren't frozen in time. Nothing is. And I think that it's really beautiful how, even though a lot of these issues we're talking about, people have definitely gone through harm. And at the same time, we have this opportunity now where we can use these as teachers, so we can all continue to move forward here on the earth in a good way. What we're doing now in the Office of Indigenous Initiatives at Western is we're really trying to help grow allies. Non-Indigenous people who can come alongside Indigenous people and follow Indigenous lead to help right the wrongs that have happened through capitalism. And these are teachers. When we have opportunities to reflect, when we have an opportunity to tell our brothers and sisters as allies, this is what you could do to help, it puts us in a really good position, especially in places of higher learning like King's or Western, to be influencing that whole next generation. So on that note, I just wanted to thank you all for this amazing work that you're doing by being teachers and pointing back to the teachers, because there is hope if we spend time and look at what our ancestors have told us and learn how to apply that, knowing that life is evolving and nothing is supposed to be static in time. I just wanted to share that. So miigwech for all of your great work. It's very inspirational, and your influence on the students in the next generation are tremendous. Miigwech.
Miigwech.
Thank you, Christy. That maybe is a nice opportunity for us to invite Noah and Cody to offer some closing remarks. I think picking up on Christy's invitation to offer, if you would, a word of hope, or a word of caution. We discussed what are the lessons that each of us should take away as individuals, but as institutions, from this initiative, but also from the discussion today.
Again, we're just coming off a jubilee year of anyone hope. We're at least for those in the church, we're really trying to look at aspects of hope in our life, and it's important to critique them. It's important to see how things could have been done better. But again, I'm really hopeful that the church will keep listening to Indigenous voices, because again, we're coming off a very, very long time where that hasn't happened, and it's not and more than anything, listening to non-Catholic Indigenous voices, listening to those who have been have had a lot taken away from them, or find their ways. That it's almost a difficult relationship to even have. That there are relationships forming because of the history, and so that in and of itself is hopeful. And I'm hopeful that things kind of are done in a better way too. That brings in more collaboration. That we're able to find ways to work together, and that especially when it comes to how things are done in community. That we could see what we really things we liked and things we disliked about what happened with the Vatican repatriations, and be able to say, okay, well, how do we keep that same spirit of profound importance and being re-entering into our our communities, but do it in a way that respects all of our agency and respects ways to kind of build together and to learn together. And so, taking opportunities to repatriate knowledge, repatriate language. Repatriate friendship, and and finding ways to kind of celebrate that and build that going forward, and then also holding the powers that be accountable at the top, but focusing on the relationships at the bottom.
To use a term Noah just used, as a non-Catholic Indigenous voice, I would say I have a tendency to be quite cynical, but I think one of the things that I would say gives me hope is the fact that Rob and King's and a Catholic institution is willing to have a very open and transparent discussion, inviting both those who are Indigenous and affiliated with the church and those who are Indigenous and not affiliated with the church. I think is important. I think it was interesting to see throughout the presentation, people started taking those small steps intellectually of the power of words, contesting and questioning gifts, I would say, looking at the church-to-church relationship, looking at artifacts as a very problematic word and language. I think that it is a positive step. I think one thing that I would tell people as a takeaway is to not consider this as something that's now said and done, but as a very, very small step of something that hopefully will continue to be quite consequential moving forward.
Oh, thank you both. Well, I want to thank our panelists for very thoughtful and meaningful teaching, I think, as Christy was saying. And at times we knew it would be a difficult conversation, and we talked a little bit about an openness to put it all out on the floor for all of us to understand. And just sort of as I just reflect on part of my own work as well, which some of you know has to do with the Catholic Church and the Holocaust, I'm reminded that when Pope Francis authorized the opening of the Vatican's wartime archives for the Holocaust era, which happened in 2019, as you recall, there were decades of requests from historians and from Jewish communities, from Holocaust survivors, for those archives to be opened and fully accessible. At the time he made the announcement, he said something that I want to share with everyone. Some of you may remember him saying this. He said, "The church is not afraid of history." That's what Francis said. I'll take the Pope at his word. So we can take that statement as genuine, but I also think it's a challenge, right? And I think that it's a challenge for the church as an institution, it's a challenge for university as an institution, and it's a reminder that this is not the end, it's the start, it's a process along the way, but your presence here today and the manner in which you engaged the dialogue, the manner of the discussion here today, I think really speaks to the possibility that we have as a learning community to play a role, however modest, in advancing this process. So I want to thank you both, and I want to thank all of you for being here tonight and for sharing your reflections. Thank you.